Hello everyone and welcome to week 5 in which we'll be talking about Medici popes, the religious landscape of early modern Florence and really early modern Italy, and the path that will eventually take Florence to becoming a Grand Duchy under Cosimo I, later in the 16th century. So we'll be talking a lot about the church and politics. Leo X, who is Giovanni de' Medici, the Medici returned to power in Florence, and the repercussions of Giovanni de' Medici being appointed Pope Leo X, which are going to have it's going to have far-reaching consequences right across the religious landscape of early modern Italy and Europe. After taking a larger view of what's going on outside Tuscany, we'll focus back in on Florence and see the kind of internal dynamics that lead the city once again to a sort of popular revolt. And we'll finish up this week by talking about the sack of Rome. Clement VII, which is another Medici pope, and his tenure as pope, which is rather disastrous, and the definitive return of the Medici, who are essentially put back into power by force through the military might, essentially, of Charles V, in the person of Alessandro de' Medici, the first Duke, not Grand Duke, but Duke of Florence. So, last week we left off about 1512 with the return of the Medici to power. Your reading for this week will go into greater detail about how this retaking of power in Florence came about, but I'd like to quickly go over this period of Florentine political history because it has some tricky twists and turns, and it's difficult to, at least it is even for me, to keep clear which Medici is ruling exactly when and what are the relationships between all of them. In fact, I highly recommend that you take a look at the Medici family tree, which is posted on the website. So from about 1494 to 1559, if we want to be really comprehensive, or for the span of about 70 years, Florence was periodically embroiled in what are now known as the Italian Wars. These were absolutely massive land conflicts, which involved complex, frequently shifting alliances between the Pope, the French King, the Holy Roman Emperor, Spain, the Ottoman Empire, just about everybody. If you really want to explain the conflicts and the incessant warfare of this period, you can do it in one word: alliances. So these conflicts that were leading up to 1512, because of course the Italian Wars, these kind of invasion after invasion of the peninsula had started in 1494. So these conflicts all led up to, kind of contributed to the election of the first Medici Pope, Giovanni de' Medici, Leo X. And it was his actions then that would put Europe on the path to the greatest religious revolution it had ever witnessed. So, in 1512, we come to the end of Republican rule in Florence, which for the past 10 years had witnessed a period of relative stability under the capable guidance of Piero Soderini, who was appointed the standard bearer, the Gonfaloniere, for life. Now, the problem was that he had developed some powerful enemies. Despite his fairly balanced, even-handed approach to rule, the Ottimati, elites, took offense to his habit of placing Soderini family members in positions of power. Nepotism is certainly nothing new in Florence at this period, indeed even today. It's definitely a part of politics. But the elites objected to what they saw as really overt nepotism in the case of Soderini. At the same time, Florence had angered Pope Julius II because the city refused to lend him and his Holy League a hand in conquering other parts of the peninsula. So when French forces withdrew from Italy, the Pope and his league headed for Florence. Here we see the Battle of Ravenna in 1512, which French forces actually defeated the Spanish Papal Holy League. However, they won the battle, but they lost the war. The territories that they had conquered were reconquered by the Holy League. So again, when French forces withdrew from Italy, the Pope heads up towards Florence, and Giovanni de' Medici and his brother Giuliano have been waiting in the wings, have been part of this papal entourage, and they themselves are leading a force of Spanish soldiers, which they're going to use to retake what they consider to be their family's heritage, to rule in Florence. So what they do, essentially Giovanni and a cadre of Spanish soldiers engage in a piece of very clever, if extremely brutal, piece of psychological warfare. They go and destroy, really just raze the city of Prato, which is just a few miles from Florence. They sack the city, they murder the men and children, they rape scores of women. It's absolute total destruction. And it's so horrific that Florence really decides to give up without a fight. They don't want the same thing to happen on their doorstep. So Piero Soderini is abandoned by his government and he flees across the Adriatic Sea to Ragusa. Meanwhile, Giovanni de' Medici and his brother retake power in Florence. And they're able to hold on to this power for really two reasons. Now, the first is that Giuliano, who is left temporarily in power when his brother goes back to Rome, he doesn't make the same mistakes that his father did. He ruled alongside the Signoria, at first anyways, and strikes a conciliatory tone overall. So he and his brother Giovanni had placated the common people by distributing bread, and then they call an emergency government, a Balia, which ends up being kind of a mix of political parties in this new emergency government. It includes the radical Ottimati, moderates, and even religious followers of Savonarola, the Frateschi, and even former advisors in Soderini's government. So at the outset, it seems as if this is going rather well. I mean, there's representation of various political groups. Yet, even this move was calculated. So it allows the Medici brothers to give the impression of a fair and balanced government, while in reality, some of the first moves the Balia made was to disband Machiavelli's militia. Then they sent home the Magistracy of the Nine, and they completely dissolved the Great Council and other cabinets that had met under Soderini's government. To add insult to injury, the Medici then transform the Salone dei Cinquecento, the great hall in which the Great Council used to meet, with its unfinished frescoes by Leonardo and Michelangelo. They take this and they transform it into this a sort of barracks, a kind of casino. It's frequented by prostitutes and soldiers. It's a sort of gambling hall, a tavern. So the message was really clear. The Medici are back in town, and this is what we think of your precious Republican government. Here you see Pope Leo X in the portrait, and it's off to his left is Giuliano, his brother, and he's sort of his right hand man, literally. So they're back in power. They start basically flaunting their absolute disgust, distrust, whatever, what you will, of Republican government. And the Florentines, in this case, don't have much of a choice, given that they have the kind of enemies at their gates. Then what would happen next, actually, would secure Medici power in Florence in an entirely different way. In 1513, Pope Julius II dies, And in the wake of that, Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici is appointed pope. So he becomes Leo the 13th Leo the 10th in 1513. At that point, he is reputed to have said, "God has given us the papacy. Now let us enjoy it." Well, he certainly did that. One of his first moves was to spread some good PR in Florence to build support for Medici rule. So he returns to Florence from Rome and he gets a hero's welcome. He parades through the streets, he's all decked out in jewels, the people are shouting "Palle, palle, palle," which is quite literally balls, which is a reference to the Medici coat of arms. Um, Paleschi is another term for the Medici. It means the party of the Medici. And you might wonder, okay, why all of a sudden do they embrace this pope, this Medici pope, who had just so recently destroyed their republican government? Well, you really can't underestimate the power of the papacy in this period. The pope is God's representative on earth, and he's a Florentine. So naturally, the citizens of Florence are proud. But they're really also very clever because certainly they're happy that they have one of their own, quote unquote, as a pope. But really, they also thought that Florence itself would prosper through papal connections of politics and patronage. So they're really expecting the Pope to do something good for them as well. This doesn't really turn out to be the case. What happens is that Leo X heads back to Rome, and he goes on an absolute building spree. It's during this period, and a bit under Julius II, his predecessor, that Rome really starts becoming the city that you see today. He hires Michelangelo to reconstruct and enlarge St. Paul's Cathedral. He hires really scores of other architects and artists to beautify the city of Rome, of course, which really have to go on a massive rebuilding spree if you think that it's a city that essentially for years had been kind of abandoned, I wouldn't say, but in a way by Julius II, maybe neglected a little bit. So in other words, he goes on this building spree. He holds lavish parties as well. He's having a really good time, so he really is enjoying the papacy, as he said. The problem with this is that it all costs money. In addition to his patronage and his parties, he also has a lot of mercenaries to pay, soldiers. So what does he do but start issuing indulgences? So indulgences are essentially like a get-out-of-jail-free card for going to hell. You buy an indulgence from the Pope, which forgives your sins. And there's only one problem with this. It's really great for the Catholics who have the money and who believe in it, but other people begin to take umbrage with this. They see it as absolutely the height of corruption of the papacy. And it's sort of fostering ill will among certain groups. In addition to that, the Pope continues to be incredibly outlandish, and he's sort of making a name for himself in a way that only popes can. But even for a pope, he's really taking it to the extreme. And one instance of this is his treatment of the death of his elephant, Hanno, who was a present given to him by the Portuguese king on the occasion of his papal coronation. So this poor elephant, which originally came from India, is a white elephant. It's absolutely prized. It's just beloved by the Pope. Leo just dotes on it. Well, the poor thing only lasts 2 years, and it gets essentially constipated. And someone has the bright idea of feeding this poor animal a laxative, ostensibly a laxative, that has a good quantity of gold in it. So yes, he's feeding a white elephant gold pills to help move its bowels. Unfortunately, this ends up killing poor Hanno. And there are these stories about Leo X being at his side as the animal dies and weeping, and he's utterly inconsolable. And at any rate, the elephant is giving this lavish funeral. And to the the rest of Europe is sort of looking on, and they're seeing this kind of ridiculous display of wealth. In the meantime, you have people essentially buying their way out of hell. There are a lot of people that are starting to say, "Wait a minute, this can't possibly be the kind of you know pope and religious hierarchy that we want." And of course, one of the most famous men to take issue with Leo X, the papacy in general, and really the Catholic Church in general, is Martin Luther. He nails his famous 95 Theses, condemnation of the Church and its practices, to the Church in Wittenberg in 1517. And this sparks off a religious revolution across Europe. This is not only a religious revolution in the sense that it's a spiritual conversion, but it also becomes highly violent conflict. And you have a series of small wars and revolutions that are breaking out all over Europe. And this is also going to have repercussions in Italy, because there are, well before the time of Luther, there's anti-clerical sentiment across Europe, which is the sense that the priests aren't doing their job. They're going off and having wives or children, or they're barely literate enough to conduct services for the church. So anti-clericalism is really nothing new. The thing that really sparks this is not only the fact that Luther is charismatic and able to concisely put forth his ideas, but it's also the advent of the printing press. So you have a printing press that is able to distribute these radical ideas very, very quickly, and then they pass through various regions of Europe with great velocity, and this spreads or really overtakes Europe. So really, in direct response to the excesses of Leo X, the Medici Pope, and there are other reasons as well, of course, but this is one of the main ones, the selling of indulgences, which is seen just to be sort of the last nail in the coffin for Martin Luther and for others who think like him.